Today, we dive into the story of a man who founded one of the most valuable companies in history. Started when he was 21, a college dropout, working out of his garage, and within 10 years, would go public and reach a valuation of over $1 billion. By 25, he was worth over $250 million. And by 30, he was fired. Fired from the company he built. He then spent $5 million on a small, little-known graphics division inside Lucasfilm. That graphics division would eventually become Pixar, and over the next decade, it went off one of cinema's greatest runs, starting with Toy Story, the first fully computer-animated film. Then came A Bug's Life, Monsters Inc., Finding Nemo, The Incredibles, Cars, Ratatouille, WALL-E, Up. When Pixar went public in 1995, it made him a billionaire overnight, and would eventually sell to Disney for $7.4 billion, making him the largest individual shareholder of Disney. Meanwhile, Apple was collapsing, bleeding billions, close to being forgotten, until they brought him back. What followed was one of the greatest turnarounds in business. He cut Apple's product lines from 350 products down to 10. Within a year, Apple went from near bankruptcy to profits. He would launch the iMac, the iPod, the iTunes stores, the iPhone and the iPad. Products that didn't just sell, they reshaped entire industries. The story that I'm about to tell you, it's not about money or products. It's about a man that never learned to code, a man that couldn't draw, couldn't engineer, and yet built the most design-obsessed technology company in history. A man that's obsessive, controlling, often difficult to work with, who believed that great products live in the intersection of technology and the liberal arts. Today, I tell you the story of Steve Jobs. This is Season 1 and Episode 2 of Crafted Archive, a show where I dive deep into the lives of individuals at the very top of their craft, the best at what they do. I give you their struggles and successes, lessons you can take away. So if you like stories like this, do me a favor, please subscribe. It allows me to keep telling stories like this, stories with the depth they deserve. Thank you. Our story begins with two people who never quite fit together, at least not in the eyes of the world around them. Joanne Schiebel was a young woman from Wisconsin raised in a conservative German Catholic family. Abdul Fattah Jandali was a Syrian graduate student, Muslim, far from home. They were both 23 when she got pregnant, and almost immediately, the world closed in on them. Marriage was never really an option. Joanne's father was dying, and he made one thing painfully clear. If she married Jandali, he would disown her. So she was left to carry this alone, caught between the man she loved and the father she was losing. She traveled to San Francisco, where a doctor quietly sheltered young women in a situation, delivering babies and arranging private adoptions. Away from judgment, Joanne had just one condition. Whoever raised her child had to be a college graduate. A lawyer and his wife were chosen, but the moment the baby arrived, they changed their minds. They wanted a girl instead. And so, on February 24th, 1955, a baby boy was born in San Francisco with no family waiting for him. That boy was Steve Jobs. He was eventually taken in by Paul Jobs, a high school dropout with an extraordinary gift for fixing things, and his wife Clara, a bookkeeper. Not the family anyone had planned, but, as it turns out, exactly the right one. Jobs knew from an early age he was adopted. Paul and Clara never hid it from him. But knowing the truth and making peace with it are two different things. People close to him believed the adoption left a mark that never fully healed. They saw it in the way he needed to control everything, in the way he treated people. A feeling of having been left behind, they believed, shaped almost everything about who he became. Jobs rejected that idea completely. He said he never felt abandoned. He felt chosen, special. He refused to call Paul and Clara his adoptive parents. They were his parents, fully, without question. As for his biological parents, he was blunt, almost to the point of cold. He called them nothing more than his sperm and egg bank. Or so he said. Because here's the thing about wounds we refuse to look at. They have a way of showing up anyway. Later in life, when Jobs was exactly the same age his biological father had been when he walked away, Jobs fathered a child of his own, and then he abandoned her. Chrisanne Brennan, the mother of that child, said that being given up for adoption had left Jobs full of broken glasses, quiet and sharp, and explained so much of his behavior. He who is abandoned, she said, is an abandoner. There's a line that captures something important about his early years. Childhood does not allow itself to be reconquered. No matter what Jobs built or became, that chapter was never really closed. But that childhood also gave him something else, something that would quietly shape every product he ever touched. Steve Jobs became one of the most design-obsessed people in the history of business. And like most things about him, you can trace it back to where he started. The first influence was his father. Paul Jobs was a meticulous man. When he built fences around their houses, he gave young Steve a hammer so he could work alongside him. And he passed down a lesson that seemed small at the time. It matters how you craft the back of a fence, even if no one else sees it. A craftsman knows. That's what makes him a craftsman. 50 years later, those fences still stand. The second was the neighborhood itself. The family lived in a community of insular homes, inexpensive houses with floor-to-ceiling glass walls, open floor plans, exposed beams, clean lines, designed by a man who believed good design doesn't have to cost a fortune, that ordinary people deserve beautiful things as well. Jobs would later say that growing up in those houses gave him something he never lost, a passion for making beautifully designed products for the mass market, not just for the wealthy, for everyone. That became the original vision for Apple. These were not the only forces that shaped how Jobs thought about design. Atari would teach him something about simplicity. Reed College would teach him about the beauty of typography. And a trip to a Xerox research lab would show him a future nobody else could see yet. But it started here, with a father who cared about the back of a fence, and houses that proved ordinary people deserve extraordinary things. And the street those houses sat on turns out to matter too. Jobs grew up on Diablo Avenue in Mountain View, California, a quiet suburban street, but you might know the area by a different name, Silicon Valley. At that time, Silicon Valley was already becoming what it would be. Engineers and scientists filled the neighborhoods, men who talked about circuits and chips over backyard fences. These weren't distant figures to Steve. They were ordinary men doing extraordinary things in ordinary houses. He wanted to be part of it. He knew that from a young age. But inspiration at home and inspiration in the classroom turned out to be very different things. Jobs ran into authority at school and hated it almost immediately. Clara had already taught him to read before he arrived, so he was ahead of everyone and bored. He pulled pranks. He was sent home multiple times before finishing 3rd grade. But his father never blamed him. Paul Jobs believed his son was special and made sure the school knew it too. If you can't keep him interested, that's on you, not him, he said. By the end of the 4th grade, Jobs tested at a high school sophomore level. His parents had him skip a grade, which made his life harder. Socially awkward to begin with, now he was a small kid thrown in with older students. In the middle of 7th grade, when the bullying became unbearable, he gave his parents an ultimatum. Put him in a different school, or he was quitting. They packed up and moved 3 miles south to Los Altos. Their new house sat at 2066 Chris Drive. 1 story, 3 bedrooms, an attached garage with a roll-down door facing the street. The garage that Paul Jobs set up to tinker with cars. And the garage where later Jobs would tinker with something that would change the world. But that was still years away. First, there was high school. At Homestead High, the new school, 2 worlds were colliding in real time. The kids buried in the circuit boards and the kids who cared about ideas and counterculture. Jobs sat at the crossroads and was drawn to both. He joined the HP Explorers Club, where students gathered in the Hewlett-Packard cafeteria on Tuesday nights to hear engineers talk about what they were actually building. He saw his first desktop computer there, the HP 9100A. Huge, maybe 40 pounds. He fell in love with it. When Jobs needed parts for a project and couldn't find them, he did something most teenagers wouldn't think to do. He picked up the phone and called Bill Hewlett, the CEO of HP. Hewlett answered, talked to him for 20 minutes, got him the parts, and landed him a summer job at the plant. Jobs was 16 years old. He had cold called the CEO of one of the most powerful tech companies in the world and gotten exactly what he wanted. It was also at Homestead High where he met Steve Wozniak, Woz for short, 5 years older and far more knowledgeable about electronics than anyone Jobs had ever met. They couldn't have been more different. Woz's father was a rocket scientist who believed engineering was the highest calling and passed that belief to his son along with one other thing: never lie, not as a rule, as a way of life. That produced a person of childlike directness, socially awkward, brilliant, completely his own person. Unlike Jobs, Woz had no hunger for the spotlight. Where Jobs wanted to change the world, Woz just wanted to build things. Jobs and Woz hit it off immediately. Same love of pranks, same love for electronics. Jobs was impressed Woz knew so much more than him. Woz was impressed Jobs understood what he was saying. It evened out. And then, in September 1971, that friendship produced its first creation. Woz was about to leave for college when he came across a magazine article, an Esquire piece called Secrets of the Little Blue Box. It talked about something strange. People had figured out how to hack the phone system and make long-distance call for free. Halfway through reading it, he got so excited he called the only person he knew would care, Steve Jobs. The article introduced a hacker named Captain Crunch, who discovered that a toy whistle from a Captain Crunch cereal box produced a tone at exactly 2600 Hz, the same frequency the phone network used to route calls. The full set of tones had been published in an old Bell System technical journal. AT&T was already calling libraries asking them to pull it. Jobs knew they had to find it before it disappeared. They broke into a closed library at Stanford that same afternoon, dug through the stacks, and found exactly what they were looking for. Weeks later, Woz had built a working blue box. They used it to call the Vatican, with Woz pretending to be Harry Kissinger requesting an urgent call with the Pope. But the bishop eventually figured out he wasn't speaking to the Secretary of State. Then Jobs had a different idea. What if we sold it? The parts cost about $40. He priced each unit at $150. They sold nearly 100 of them. Until the night, Jobs pitched the wrong people and found himself staring down the barrel of a gun. The blue box business was done. But something more important had been built. Years later, Jobs would say, if he hadn't been for the blue boxes, there wouldn't have been an Apple. They had learned to work together. They learned they could take a technical idea, build it, package it, and put it into the world. The template was set. Woz would be the inventor, the quiet wizard who could build almost anything, and would have happily given it all away for free. Jobs would be the one who figured out how to make it useful, how to package it, and how to sell it. That would define everything that came next. After high school, Jobs went to Reed College in Portland, Oregon, one of the most expensive schools in the country, and one his parents could barely afford. He lasted about 6 months before the guilt became unbearable. His parents were spending everything they had, and he had no idea what he wanted to do with his life. So he dropped out, but not fully. The dean saw something in him and let him stay. Jobs slept on friends' floors, collected empty bottles for change, walked to the Hare Krishna temple on Sundays for free meals. He skipped every required class and audited whatever caught his attention, which is how he ended up in a calligraphy class. He wandered in because of the beautiful hand-lettered posters around campus. He learned about typefaces, about spacings, about what separates good typography from great. It seemed completely useless at the time. Purely art, no practical application. Until, 10 years later, every one of those lessons ended up in a Macintosh. The first personal computer that actually cared about how words looked on a screen. Multiple typefaces, proportional spacing, beautiful fonts named after great cities. If I had never dropped in on that single course, he would say in his Stanford commencement address, the Mac would never have had beautiful typography, and since Windows just copied the Mac, it's likely that no personal computer would ever have them. Jobs couldn't have connected the dots going forward. Nobody can. You can only connect them looking backwards. After Reed, Jobs moved back to his parents' house in Los Altos and started looking for work. One classified ad caught his eye. Just forwards. Have fun. Make money. That was Atari, founded by Nolan Bushnell, the father of electronic gaming. Atari had already released Pong and set the entire arcade industry on fire. Jobs didn't send in a resume. He walked into the Atari lobby barefoot, told the personnel director he wasn't leaving until someone gave him a job, and within minutes had talked his way in front of the chief engineer. He was hired on the spot. But it didn't take long for problems to surface. The extreme diets Jobs had adopted at Reed had convinced him that someone who ate the way he did wouldn't produce body odor. He was wrong. The complaints were immediate. Jobs was also blunt, dismissive, and convinced he was the smartest person in the room. Bushnell's solution was elegant. He moved Jobs to the night shift, no colleagues to offend, and Bushnell knew that Jobs' friend, Wozniak, a brilliant engineer at HP, often hung around the offices after hours. Put Jobs on nights, and you effectively get 2 Steves for the price of one. Atari gave Jobs something that would stay with him forever. The games had no manuals, no instructions. You just picked them up and played. If a first-year college student, half asleep, couldn't figure it out in 30 seconds, it wasn't good enough. Simplicity wasn't a feature. It was the whole point. Bushnell also gave him a line Jobs never forget. If you act like you can do something, people will believe you can. Pretend to be completely in control, and people will assume that you are. For better or worse, Jobs never forget that. But by early 1974, Jobs was restless. A friend had returned from India full of stories about gurus and enlightenment. Jobs decided to go. This wasn't about adventure. It was a genuine search. There was a hole in him, partly from not knowing his birth parents, and he was trying to fill it. He made his way to India. Within days, he was sick. He dropped 40 pounds in a week. When he recovered, he travelled north, sought out the guru he had come to find, and discovered that Neem Karoli Baba, the guru they was finding, had already passed away. So Jobs settled in. He read. He walked. He started to let go of the idea that enlightenment was something you could find if you looked hard enough. 7 months later, he flew home. Shaved head, Indian robes, skin darkened by the sun. His parents walked past him 5 times at the airport before his mother could recognize him. He had gone to India searching for answers. He came back with something different, a sharpened sense of self, and an appetite to build. Jobs shuffled back to Atari barefoot and asked for his job back. They said yes. The San Francisco Bay Area in the mid-70s was unlike anywhere else on Earth. Military contractors and microchip companies on one side, hippies and activists on the other. Technology and counterculture didn't just coexist, they fed each other. Jobs was right in the middle of it. And then, in March 1975, a flyer appeared on a bulletin board at Hewlett-Packard asking a simple question. Are you building your own computer? Come meet people who are doing the same thing. Wars went. He later said it was one of the most important nights of his life. During the meeting, someone passed around a specification sheet for a new microprocessor. Boss picked it up and something clicked. He had been working on a terminal, a keyboard and screen that connected remotely to a much larger computer somewhere else. But looking at the chip, he realized he could put the computing power inside the terminal itself. It could become its own machine, a personal computer, something that sat on a desk and belonged to one person. He went home and started building. After a couple of months, he was ready to test it. He typed a few keys. Letters appeared on the screen. It was June 29th, 1975. For the first time in history, someone had typed on a keyboard and seen the results appear on their own personal computer screen, in their home. At the time, computers filled entire rooms. They were operated by institutions, universities, governments, corporations. The idea that you could have one on the desk, that you could type something and immediately see it, that simply didn't exist. What Steve Wozniak had just done, alone in a cubicle after hours, was make that real for the first time. Jobs was immediately interested. He peppered Woz with questions, and then he said 5 words that changed both of their lives. Why don't we sell it? Woz hadn't even considered it, but Jobs had already worked out the numbers. And when the numbers didn't move Woz, he tried something else. Even if we lose our money, he said, as they drove around in his Volkswagen bus, we'll have a company. For once in our lives, we'll have a company. That landed. They raised about $1,300 between them. They needed a name, and Jobs had just came back from a fruit farm, was deep into a fruitarian diet, and suggested Apple. Fun, approachable, and practically speaking, it would put them ahead of Atari in the phone books. And so, Apple was born. But now, Apple needed customers. So Jobs walked barefoot into a computer store called the Byte Shop. The owner, Paul Terrell, liked what he saw, but he had one condition. He didn't want bare circuit boards that customers would have to finish assembling themselves. He wanted complete working computers, ready to use out of the box. Jobs said yes without hesitating. Terrell placed an order of 50 fully assembled computers at $500 each, $25,000 total. Apple had made its first sale. No office, no products, no company in any real sense. Just 2 guys and a circuit board. 50 computers at $500 each, $25,000. Jobs was 21 years old. They built them in Jobs' family garage, the same garage Paul Jobs had set up for tinkering with cars all those years ago. Everyone pitched in. Jobs, Woz, his parents, his sisters, all of them spread across the kitchen table and workbench. His father set up labeled drawers for components and rigged a heatbox to stress test the finished boards overnight. 30 days later, they had delivered everything. This was the Apple I computer. It was a start. But Jobs had already seen enough to know it wasn't the final version. Walking the floor of the first Personnel Computer Festival in Atlantic City, he noticed that the competing machines, the ones with proper metal cases, built-in keyboards, power supplies, looked like something a real company had made. The Apple one looked like something made in a garage. Because it was. The next Apple needed to be a complete product. Everything included. Everything working from the moment you open the box. That was going to be the Apple II. To build it properly, they needed serious money. And serious money required a serious partner. Mike McCullough was only 33, but he had already made enough from his Intel stock options to retire. When he put up to Jobs' garage for their first meeting, he arrived in a gold Corvette. He looked past the fact that neither Jobs nor Woz had a recent haircut, and was immediately struck by what he saw on the workbench. "You can always get a haircut," he said. McCullough proposed they write a business plan together. What he laid out was a vision far beyond hobbyists. Ordinary people in ordinary homes, using computers to manage their lives. Then he made a prediction that sounded almost absurd. "We are going to be a Fortune 500 company in 2 years. This is the start of an industry. It happens once in a decade." It took Apple 7 years, not 2, but the spirit of what he said turned out to be exactly right. McCullough offered to guarantee a line of credit of up to $250,000 for a 1/3 stake. He also taught Jobs something he called the Apple marketing philosophy. Just 3 ideas written on a single page. The first, empathy. Know your customer better than anyone else. The second, focus. Do a few things properly, cut everything else. And the last one, the one that will stay with Jobs the rest of his life, impute. The idea that people judge a product by how it's presented, that packaging and first impressions aren't superficial, they are part of the product itself. A great thing presented poorly will be perceived as a poor thing. Decades later, talking about the iPhone, Jobs said Mike taught him that. The Apple II launched at the first West Coast Computer Fair in April of 1977. Jobs had secured a spot right in front of the hall, while other exhibitors showed up with card tables and handwritten signs. Apple had a counter draped in black velvet, a backlit logo, and staff in matching 3-piece suits. But they only had 3 finished Apple IIs to display, so they stacked the empty boxes behind them to make it look like more. Apple got 300 orders at the show. Over the following years, the Apple II would sell close to 6 million units, more than any other single machine. It launched the personal computer industry. And then, in December 1980, Apple went public. When McCullough first joined Jobs and Woz in December 1977, they had valued Apple at just over $5,000. Less than 4 years later, the company was worth $1.79 billion. In the process, it created 300 millionaires overnight. Jobs was 25 years old. He was now worth $256 million. But what happened around the IPO revealed something important about the two men at the center of it all. Woz, before the shares went public, quietly sold his own options at a very low price to around 40 mid-level Apple employees. People who had worked hard but fallen just below the cutoff for stock options. Most of them made enough to buy a home. He later gave shares outright to others he felt had been shortchanged. Everyone loved Woz for it. Jobs did nothing of the sort. When a close friend who had been there almost from the very beginning, someone who had travelled to India with him, lived with him, worked alongside him in the garage, fell below the cutoff, Jobs brushed him off every time he raised it. When another engineer suggested they give some of their own options to the man, Jobs looked at him and said simply, "Okay, I'll give him 0. Two men, the same company, the same moment, completely different instincts. It was never more clear who they each were, and that difference extended to how each of them saw what came next. Woz was content. He had built something extraordinary. People he respected were using it, and that was enough. Jobs was not content. The Apple II had made him rich and made him famous, but it will always be seen as Woz's machine. The machine belonged to Woz in the public eye. He needed something he could point to and call his own. But before that could happen, something personal caught up with Jobs. Brennan, his on and off girlfriend, was pregnant. On May 17th, 1978, she gave birth to a baby girl. They named her Lisa. Jobs helped choose the name, then went back to work. He distanced himself, questioned whether the child was even his. Brennan and Lisa ended up living in a small house in Menlo Park, surviving on welfare. DNA test came back at 94% probability, but Jobs kept denying it. He was 23 years old, the same age his biological father had been when he walked away from Jobs. The same pattern, the same age, a generation later. Years later, Jobs admitted he had handled it badly. "I could not see myself as a father then, but if I could do it over, I would do a better job, he said. He moved on, started working on a new computer, something more powerful, more advanced, more ambitious, something he could call his own. He named it Delisa, the same name as the daughter he had just denied in court, the daughter he had just called someone else's child. Whether it was guilt or love expressed sideways, or something he couldn't quite explain even to himself, nobody ever fully knew. What was clear was this: the little girl he had walked away from and the computer he was pouring everything into now shared the same name. The Lisa project had started promisingly enough, but Jobs was difficult, impossible some said, to work with. He micromanaged every detail, called engineers at 2 in the morning, pushed his ideas on the interface, bypassed the official management structure entirely. The team was talented, but exhausted. The senior engineers, many of them polished professionals, resented the intrusions and the insults that came with them. In September 1980, Apple's management had seen enough. They quietly reorganized the company. The Lisa division got a proper manager, and Jobs was removed from it. He had lost the computer he named after his daughter. It wasn't the last time Apple would take something away from him, but it was the first, and he left a mark. What saved him, or at least gave him somewhere to direct his attention, was a small, underfunded project tucked away in a building a few blocks from Apple's main campus, the Macintosh. Then, in December 1979, everything changed. A researcher at Apple had been pushing Jobs for months to visit Xerox PARC, the Palo Alto Research Center, a kind of ideas laboratory that Xerox had set up and then largely left alone. The engineers there had been quietly building the future, while their bosses back in Connecticut focused on selling photocopiers. Jobs made a deal. Xerox investment arm could put money into Apple's next funding round. But first, they had to open the doors at PARC. It was one of the most consequential deals ever made in Silicon Valley, and Xerox had no idea what they were giving away. What Jobs saw that day stopped him cold. Instead of typing commands into a dark screen, you could see your files laid out in front of you like papers on a desk. You could point at them with a small device, a mouse, and click to open them. Windows overlapped on screens, icons represented folders and programs. Everything was visual. Everything was intuitive. What I just described is essentially the modern computer interface. But to understand how radical this was, you have to picture what computers looked like at the time. A black screen, a blinking cursor, a command line waiting for you to type the exact right instructions. No images, no icons, nothing to click. If you didn't know the commands, you couldn't use the computer. Jobs couldn't stand still. He bounced around the room, firing questions, waving his arms. He drove back to Apple at speed, his mind racing faster than a car. He had found what he was looking for. Now, the story is sometimes told as a straightforward heist. Apple walked in and stole the future. Jobs himself occasionally said as much, proudly quoting Picasso. Good artists copy. Great artists steal. But the fuller truth is more interesting. Xerox had already tried to bring this to market. In 1981, they released the Xerox Star. It cost $16,595. It was slow, clunky, aimed at large corporations, and sold 30,000 units before quietly disappearing. What Apple built was significantly better in almost every way. The Xerox mouse had 3 buttons, cost $300, and barely moved smoothly. Jobs walked into a design firm days after the PARC visit and told them he wanted a single button mouse that cost $15. They built it. The Xerox interface still required type commands for most functions. Apple's let you touch, drag, click, drop. Windows could overlap and move, something Xerox engineers hadn't even managed. It wasn't theft, it was execution. The difference between a great idea and a great product. This would be the base for the Macintosh, Mac for short. Jobs threw himself into the Mac project completely. A small team, a separate building. It reminded him of the garage. He was looking for people who were brilliant, creative, and slightly rebellious. He would pull a cloth off a Mac prototype and watch their faces. If their eyes lit up, if they reached straight for the mouse, he hired them. Design wasn't decoration to Jobs. It was the product itself. He had grown up in those Ichlo homes. Good design, made affordable. His father had taught him to care about the back of the cabinet, the parts nobody sees. Jobs dropped the phone book on the table and told his designers the computer's footprint shouldn't be any bigger than that. He wanted the machine to look friendly. Not cute, friendly. As the design evolved, the Mac began to subtly resemble a human face. He became equally obsessed with the fonts. named after great cities: Chicago, New York, Geneva, London, San Francisco. He rejected a circuit board inside the machine because the lines just weren't straight enough. No one would ever see it. That wasn't the point. A good carpenter doesn't use cheap wood for the back of the cabinet just because nobody sees it. The circuit board was redesigned. Then there was the reality distortion field. The phrase was borrowed from Star Trek, an episode where aliens create an entirely new world through sheer mental force. One of the Mac team engineers, Bob Tribble, was the first to use it to describe Jobs. What he meant was both a compliment and a warning. In Jobs' presence, reality became malleable. He could convince almost anyone of almost anything. An engineer would tell him a feature was impossible, that it would take a year, that the hardware couldn't support it. Jobs would look at them and tell them it needed to be ready in 2 weeks. And they'll go away and do it. Not because he had shown them a better way, but because in his presence, their sense of what was possible had shifted. What made it particularly hard to resist was that it worked even when you knew it was happening. When one of his engineers complained that shaving 10 seconds off the Mac's startup time was technically impossible, Jobs went to the whiteboard and did the math. 5 million users, 10 seconds each day. That added up to hundreds of millions of seconds saved every year. Dozens of lifetimes. The engineers went away and came back weeks later, having cut 28 seconds off the boot time. Jobs had a way of making the personal feel universal and the impossible feel urgent. It fed directly into how he categorized the world. Everything and everyone fell into one of two buckets: brilliant or worthless, a genius or an idiot. There were no middle grounds. And yet, underneath all the volatility, Jobs had a very strong sense of emotional intelligence. He could read people with unsettling accuracy. He knew exactly where someone's insecurities were. He could devastate someone with a perfectly aimed observation and then, hours later, elevate the same person with praise that made them feel like the most important person in the room. The Mac team gave out an annual award to the person who had best stood up to him. Jobs knew about it and approved. He respected people who held their ground. He just made sure you had to earn the right to do so. The team made t-shirts that said that they were working 90 hours a week and loving it. They weren't entirely joking. Years later, almost every one of them would look back on that period as one of the most intense and meaningful experiences of their lives. By the end of 1983, everything was riding on a Macintosh. Jobs wasn't just trying to launch product, he was trying to start a cultural movement. He asked his advertising agency, Chart Day, for something that would stop people in their tracks. Not a product demonstration, not a list of features, something that would make people feel something. What they came back with was a 60-second film directed by Ridley Scott, the British filmmaker fresh off Blade Runner. It was set in a bleak dystopian world, a reference to George Orwell's novel, 1984, where a totalitarian government called Big Brother controlled every aspect of human life. In the ad, hollow-eyed drones sat in silence watching Big Brother on a giant screen. Then, a young woman comes running through the hall, swings a sledgehammer, and destroys it in a burst of light. Then a line appeared at the end. On January 24th, Apple Computer will introduce Macintosh. And you'll see why 1984 won't be like 1984. IBM was Big Brother. Apple was the woman with the sledgehammer. Nobody had to explain it. You just felt it. When Jobs showed it to the Apple board, the room went completely silent. One board member put his head on the table, and most of them thought that it was the worst commercial they had ever seen. They asked the agency to sell the Super Bowl slots back. Jobs was furious. One evening, Woz wandered in and Jobs played him the ad. Woz was stunned and immediately offered to split the cost of the Super Bowl ad slot, half each. He didn't need to. Chart Day sold the shorter slot and quietly held onto the other. The head of marketing made the final call. They were going for it. Early in the third quarter of Super Bowl 18, more than 96 million people watched something they had never seen before. All three major networks ran news stories about it that same evening. It would eventually be named the greatest commercial of all time. The launch was January 24th, 1984, at a packed 2,600-seat auditorium. Jobs walked out in a double-breasted blue blazer, a white t-shirt, and a pale green bow tie. He opened up by quoting Bob Dylan, the poet of his generation, the voice he had grown up listening to. The loser now will be the later to win. The line he chose was no accident. Apple was the underdog. IBM had the money, the trust, the corporate world behind them. He walked to a small table, pulled the Mac out from a cloth bag, slipped the floppy disk from his shirt pocket, and let the demo run. The triumphant theme of Chariots of Fire, the 1981 film about Olympic runner that had swept the year's academic awards, filled the auditorium. The word Macintosh scrolled across the screen. Then, in slow handwritten script, insanely great. Then he walked back to the computer, pressed the mouse, and in a warm electronic voice, the Macintosh spoke for the first time in public. Hello, I'm Macintosh. It sure is great to get out of the bag. Never trust a computer you can't lift. And it is with considerable pride that I introduce a man who has been like a father to me, Steve Jobs. The auditorium lost its mind. Jobs stood at the front of the stage, nodding slowly, and then he started to cry. The ovation went on for 5 minutes. He had done it. The Mac was out in the world. But even as Jobs was taking his bow, someone else had been watching very carefully, taking notes and making plans. History has a pattern of producing two dominant forces at the same time. Two people whose talents, ambitions, and rivalry end up defining an entire era. You see it everywhere once you start looking. Napoleon and Wellington, Muhammad Ali and Joe Frazier, the Beatles and the Rolling Stones. Two forces pulling in the opposite directions with equal strength. And in doing so, pulling the whole world forward between them. For the first 30 years of personal computing, that pattern held true. Two college dropouts, both born in 1955, would between them shape everything. His name was Bill Gates. Where Jobs was intuitive and romantic, Gates was analytical and methodical. Each thought he was smarter than the other. Jobs treated Gates as someone slightly inferior, especially when it comes to taste. Gates looked down on Jobs because he couldn't write code. When the Macintosh was being developed, Jobs flew to Seattle and pitched Gates on building software for the new machine. Apple's revenue were $1 billion, Microsoft's were $32 million. Gates signed on to build Excel, Word, and BASIC for the Mac. He became a regular presence at Apple. He attended retreats, sat in on meetings, and watched Jobs operate up close. He also studied the Mac's graphical interface very carefully. In November 1983, 2 months before the Mac even launched, Gates held a press event in New York and announced that Microsoft was building a new operating system for IBM PCs. It would have windows, icons, and a mouse. It would be called Windows. Jobs summoned Gates to Cupertino. Gates arrived alone. Jobs had 10 Apple employees in the room, all watching as he turned on Gates. "You're ripping us off," he shouted. "I trusted you and now you're stealing from us." Gates sat there calmly, looked Jobs directly in the eye, and delivered one of the most famous comebacks in Silicon Valley history. "We both had this rich neighbor named Xerox. I broke into his house to steal the TV set and found out that you had already stolen it." The room went quiet. Courts eventually ruled in Microsoft's favor. The look and feel of a graphical interface, it turned out, was nearly impossible to protect. Microsoft took something rougher, cheaper, and less beautiful, and through sheer persistence and economics of an open platform, won the operating system war. The best products don't always win. Jobs knew that better than anyone, and he hated knowing it. But Microsoft wasn't the only problem. While the Macintosh was being built, Apple was growing fast, faster than Jobs could manage alone. The company that had started in a garage now had thousands of employees, hundreds of millions in revenue, and a board of directors who were starting to ask uncomfortable questions about who was actually in charge. Jobs was 27 years old, brilliant, visionary, and by almost everyone's account, extremely difficult to work with. He knew how to build products. He knew how to inspire a team. What he didn't know, and what he was slowly beginning to realize, was how to run the company. He needed someone older, someone seasoned, someone who had built something real in the world beyond Silicon Valley and could teach him how to do the same. In other words, he needed a mentor. What he found was John Sculley. John Sculley was president of Pepsi Cola, the man behind the Pepsi Challenge campaign that had shaken up the entire soft drink industry. Jobs met him in early 1983, and something unexpected happened. They genuinely hit it off. Jobs flew to New York. They walked through Central Park for hours, talking about business, art, music, life. They visited the Metropolitan Museum, where Sculley talked about Greek and Roman sculpture and Jobs listened, genuinely absorbing. They walked down Broadway to a record shop where Jobs played him his favorite songs. Jobs said he had been one of the most exciting evenings of his life. Sculley felt exactly the same way. He had spent his entire career in the careful, structured world of corporate America. Jobs was unlike anyone he had encountered before. The energy, the intensity, The way a conversation with him felt like the most important one you had ever had. Sculley started to see something of himself in Jobs. The impatience, the hunger, the way ideas came in rapid bursts. They talked a dozen times a day. Jobs would call at 2 in the morning just because an idea had crossed his mind. Sculley loved it. They could finish each other's sentences. Both of them believed they were people cut from the same cloth. Two creative minds who had arrived at the same place from completely opposite directions. Then came the moment that sealed it. Jobs looked at Sculley on a terrace on Central Park West and said what would become perhaps the most famous line in Silicon Valley history. Do you want to spend the rest of your life selling sugared water, or do you want a chance to change the world? Sculley felt like he had been punched. There was nothing left to say. He said yes. The relationship only deepened after Sculley joined Apple. He would show up at Jobs' barely furnished house on weekend mornings unannounced. They would sit for hours talking about ideas, about what they were building, about the future. Jobs confided in Sculley that he believed that he would die young, that he needed to move fast, that he had only a short window to leave something meaningful behind. Sculley was deeply moved. He had never met anyone who lived with that kind of urgency. They talked constantly, openly, warmly. Sculley felt that he had found not just a business partner, but a genuine kindred spirit. Someone building something that mattered. Someone who understood him. Sculley was absolutely certain that this was one of the great relationships of his life. This was all self-delusion. Privately, quietly, and months earlier than anyone knew, Jobs had already arrived at a completely different conclusion. We had different ways of looking at the world, Jobs later said. I began to realize this a few months after he arrived. He didn't learn things very quickly, and the people he wanted to promote were usually bozos. A few months after he arrived, while Sculley was finishing each other's sentences and calling it a soul connection, Jobs had already made his assessment. He had seen it almost immediately, and he had said nothing. Not because he was being deliberately cruel, but because Jobs had a way of seeing people with total clarity. Their strengths, their weaknesses, what they could offer, where they fell short, and filing it away. He wanted Sculley to be the mentor he was looking for. He had genuinely tried to find that in him, and when he realized it wasn't there, something colder took over. He kept the warmth on the surface, he kept the phone calls coming, but underneath, the connection that Sculley believed in so completely had quietly ceased to exist for Jobs. The romance was entirely real on Sculley's side. On Jobs, it had somewhere along the way become something he maintained out of convenience. A relationship he could use to keep the company running while he finished the Mac. And like all things built on a gap between what two people believe, it was only a matter of time before it collapsed. The first crack came over the price of the Macintosh. Jobs had planned to sell it at $1,995. Affordable, accessible, built for the people he cared about. Sculley pushed to raise it by $500 to cover the marketing budget. To Jobs, it wasn't a business disagreement. It was a betrayal. The Mac went out at $2,495. Jobs never forgave him for it. He believed that single decision had handled Microsoft the opening it needed to dominate the industry for the next 2 decades. The distance between them, invisible at first, had begun to open. The Mac was beautiful, revolutionary, but it was also slow, expensive, and by the standards of what people actually needed to get work done, deeply underpowered. The processor Jobs had insisted on was pushing the limits of what the hardware could handle. The memory was too small. There was no hard drive. Jobs had refused to include one, convinced a single floppy disk was enough. And without a fan, which Jobs had eliminated because he believed it disrupted the quiet experience of using a computer, components regularly overheated. And there was a price. At $2,495, the price Sculley had pushed it over Jobs' furious objections. The Mac was out of reach for the ordinary people Jobs had always said he was building it for. The very people he had designed it for couldn't afford it. And IBM, which Jobs had dismissed as slow and uncreative, had done something Apple hadn't. They had opened their platform. Any manufacturer could build an IBM-compatible computer. Any developer could write software for it. The ecosystem was exploding, while Apple's remained closed, controlled, and expensive. The reality distortion field could push a team to do the impossible. It couldn't make customers buy a computer that was too slow, too expensive, and too limited for their needs. Reality had caught up. And then, before any of that could be resolved, Apple lost something it couldn't afford to lose. Steve Wozniak quietly resigned. There was no press release, no farewell dinners, no drama. Because Woz wasn't wired for drama. He had spent the last year working as a mid-level engineer at the Apple II division, keeping his head down, staying as far from the politics as he could. The irony was that his division was the one keeping the lights on. 70% of Apple's sales that Christmas came from the Apple II, and yet, the people behind it were treated like they didn't matter. Woz felt that deeply, so he called Sculley directly, told him that too much attention was going to the Mac division, and not enough to the people actually generating revenue. Nothing changed. So Woz made a decision. He was leaving to build something new. He didn't think to tell Jobs directly. He didn't feel like he needed to. Jobs found out when he hit the Wall Street Journal. The two Steves had started Apple together in a garage with $1,300 between them. Now one of them was gone. The original partnership, the one they had begun with a magazine article on a kitchen table and a Sunday drive to a closed library, was over. Jobs was losing the company. He just didn't know it yet. And instead of fixing any of it, he wandered the halls, frustrated, furious, taking it out on everyone around him. Sculley watched all of this and didn't know what to do with him. He had been hired to run the company, not manage a force of nature. Every time he tried to bring structure, Jobs pushed back. Every time he tried to set directions, Jobs went around him. They had stopped finishing each other's sentences. Now, they could barely finish a meeting. The board had seen enough. They ordered both men to stay in their lanes. It didn't hold. Jobs tried to orchestrate a coup while Sculley was away on a trip to China. He told his inner circle he was going to remove Sculley and take back the company. Sculley found out and cancelled the trip. The following Friday, Jobs walked into the executive staff meeting late, dressed sharply, looking calm. Sculley looked pale. He pushed the agenda aside. "It's come to my attention that you like to throw me out of the company. Is that true?" Jobs didn't look away. "I think you're bad for Apple. I think you're the wrong person to run the company. You really should leave." Then Sculley did something unexpected. He pulled the room. He turned to everyone around that table and asked them to choose, one by one. People who genuinely liked Jobs and didn't particularly care for Sculley still choose Sculley. Jobs looked around the room. "I guess I know where things stand." He walked out. No one followed. The board backed Sculley unanimously. Jobs was stripped off his role. His new title was non-executive chairman, Apple's public face, with no operational control over anything. In the weeks that followed, Jobs went back to his house in Woodside and didn't come out for days. He kept the blinds drawn, let the answering machine pick up, and sat alone playing Bob Dylan on repeat. Mostly one song. The times they are changing. The same song he had quoted on stage the day he unveiled the Macintosh. The verse he loved most ended with a simple promise. For the loser now, will be the later to win. Eventually a few close friends showed up at his door. When they finally got in, one of them asked, "Is it really that bad as it looks?" Jobs didn't hesitate. "It's worse. It's much worse than you can imagine." What made it all harder was who had turned their backs on him. Sculley had once been a mentor. Makula had once been a mentor. Arthur Rock, the veteran venture capitalist who had been one of Apple's earliest believers, a man Jobs had gone to the opera with, travelled with, looked up for years, had once been a mentor too. In the span of 1 week, all three had chosen Sculley over him. It gets back to the deep feeling of being rejected at an early age. A close friend said, "It's a deep part of who he believes he is." Jobs got off the country, drove through Tuscany, walked the streets of Florence, taking in the buildings, the materials. He was particularly struck by the paving stones. A calm, bluish-grey sandstone from a quarry near a small Tuscan town. 20 years later, those same stones will cover the floors of Apple's retail stores around the world. But that was 20 years away. Right now, Jobs was 30 years old, freshly fired from the company he had built, and sitting middle of a Tuscan street with nothing but time and money and something to prove. For most people, that would have been the end of the story. For Jobs, it was just the beginning of the next chapter. He came back to California and started a new company. He called it NeXT. Before designing a single product, he commissioned a logo from Powell, the 71-year-old designer behind the identities of IBM, ABC and UPS. Ren flew to Palo Alto, spent time with Jobs, came back 2 weeks later with a single proposal. He didn't do options, one solution, take it or leave it. The fee was $100,000. Jobs stared at it, then hugged him. At NeXT, with nobody to rein him in, his obsessive perfectionism ran completely out of control. He wanted a perfect cube for the computer. Each side exactly 1 foot, every angle precisely 90 degrees. The molds alone cost $650,000. When he spotted a hairline mark on the chassis that any other manufacturer would have quietly accepted, he flew to Chicago and made them start over. Most revealing, he had a matte black finish applied to the inside of the case as well, the parts only repairmen would ever see. His father had taught him to care about the back of the cabinet. At NeXT, with no one to stop him, that lesson ran completely out of control. The NeXT computer launched with tremendous fanfare in 1988. 3,000 people lined up outside Symphony Hall. Jobs was on the stage for 3 hours. The audience cheered. Then he announced the price, $6,500 for students. The academic advisors in the front rows, who had been told to expect something closer to $2,000, were quietly appalled. The factory he built to produce 10,000 units a month eventually sold 400. But while NeXT was finding its limits, something else was quietly taking shape. In 1986, Jobs bought a small computer division from Lucasfilm, the filmmaker behind Star Wars, for $5 million, with another $5 million committed to set it up as a standalone company. Lucas was going through a difficult divorce and needed cash quickly. The division made high-end hardware and software for rendering digital images. It also had something else, a small group of animators quietly making short films to show off what the technology could do. Nobody was quite sure what the division was yet, not even the people running it. They didn't want to sell it to Jobs outright. They wanted an investor, someone who would fund them and let them find their own way. Jobs proposed a middle ground. He would buy a majority stake and serve as chairman, but let them run the company day by day. Jobs ended up with 70% of a company he didn't fully understand yet, built around technology he couldn't quite explain, making films that had no clear business model. He named it after its most important piece of hardware, a computer called the Pixar Image Computer. Pixar. The animator running that group was John Lasseter, a Hawaiian shirt-wearing former Disney animator who had been fired for pushing too hard, too fast. The moment Jobs met him, something clicked. Lasseter was an artist, and Jobs had always responded to artists. In 1986, Lasseter made a 2-minute animated short, a story about a parent lamp and a child lamp playing with a ball until it pops. Jobs flew to Dallas to see it screened at a computer graphics conference, fast-talked his way to the front of the queue, and watched it with the audience. It got a standing ovation. Jobs was electric afterwards. He finally understood what Pixar was really about. It wasn't about hardware or software. It was the same thing that Macintosh had been about. Art and technology made inseparable. For years, Pixar kept losing money. Jobs poured tens of millions of his own dollars in, with no clear end in sight. Every rational sign pointed towards selling, but in every brutal budget-cutting session, when everything else had been slashed, Lasseter would quietly ask if there was anything left for the next film. Jobs always said yes. Then, Pixar made Toy Story, November 1995. It made back its entire budget in the first weekend. By the end of its run, $362 million worldwide, the highest grossing film for that year, beating Batman Forever and Apollo 13. But Jobs had seen this coming, or at least he had bet on it. To understand why, you need to know how Pixar got to Toy Story in the first place. When Jobs first bought Pixar, the company had no real business model, no guaranteed revenue, just a small team of animators making short films on expensive hardwares that nobody was buying. To survive, they needed a partner, someone with the distribution muscle, the marketing power, and the brand recognition to actually get their films into cinemas around the world. That partner was Disney. Disney was the most powerful name in animation, the studio behind Snow White, Cinderella, and The Lion King. In 1991, Pixar struck a deal with them to co-produce a series of animated feature films. It sounded like a dream partnership, but the reality was less flattering. Pixar was broke and desperate, and Disney knew it. The deal reflected that. Disney owned the films outright. Disney had creative control. Disney could make sequels without Pixar. Pixar would receive a small percentage of ticket revenues and very little else. It was, in every meaningful sense, the deal of a company that had no choice. Jobs took it and told himself he would fix it later. Toy Story was the first film under that deal, and Jobs had deliberately timed Pixar's IPO to launch 1 week after it opened. A calculated gamble. If the film flopped, the IPO would die. If it succeeded, the timing would be perfect. The money would give Jobs exactly what he needed to walk into Disney and rewrite the deal as an equal. 1 week after Toy Story opened, Pixar went public. Jobs had priced the shares at $22. In the first hour of trading, the stock shot up to $45. Trading had to be halted. By the end of that single day, the stake Jobs had held onto through every dark year was worth $1.2 billion. Steve Jobs became a billionaire at 40, not from Apple, but from Pixar. He had gone in nearly broke, desperate, and without a clear plan. He had been wrong about the hardware, wrong about the software, but he had protected Lasseter when no one else would, funded films when there were no business case, and held firm through every moment when the rational thing would have been to sell. In 2006, Disney acquired Pixar for $7.4 billion. Jobs received approximately $3.7 billion in Disney shares, making him Disney's largest individual shareholder, larger than the descendants of Walt Disney himself. The irrational bet had paid off beyond anything he could have imagined. But during the time when NeXT was struggling and Pixar was bleeding money, something else had been quietly taking shape in his life. Something that had nothing to do with products or companies or billion-dollar deals. It started with a lecture. In October 1989, Jobs had agreed to speak at Stanford Business School. He was shown to his seat just before being introduced. He looked to his right, and there was a young woman sitting next to him. They started chatting. She was sharp, funny, and completely at ease. At some point, she joked that she was only there because she had won the raffle, and that the prize was getting to take him to dinner. Jobs laughed. Then he went on stage to give the lecture. After the lecture, he watched her get up to leave. Jobs bolted after her, brushing past the dean who was trying to grab him for a conversation, and caught up with her in the parking lot. He reminded her about the raffle, asked if Saturday worked for dinner. She agreed. Jobs walked back to his car, then stopped, turned around and ran back. He asked if she wanted to have dinner that night instead. She said yes, found a small vegetarian restaurant and stayed for 4 hours. Jobs called it one of the best evenings of his life. Her name was Laurene Powell. She was a new graduate student at Stanford's Business School, and she had almost not gone back to the lecture at all. She had even mixed up who the speaker was, confusing Jobs with Bill Gates in her mind. He proposed on New Year's Day, 1990, then didn't mention it again for months. By September, Laurene had enough of waiting and moved out. Eventually, he came to his senses, gave her a diamond ring in October, and she moved back in. They were married on March 18, 1991, and went on to have 3 children together. For a man who had spent most of his adult life pouring everything into his work, it was the first time something had anchored him in the world in a different way. Laurene wasn't impressed by the mythology. She wasn't dazzled by the reality distortion feel. She just loved him, clearly. Clearly enough to walk out when he wasn't showing up, and steadily enough to walk back in when he did. He needed that more than he knew. But even as his personal life was finding its footing, something had been happening in the background that he couldn't ignore any longer. Apple was falling apart. The company he had founded in a garage, the company he had been pushed out of, was dying. Apple's market share had collapsed from 16% at its peak to around 4%. Sculley, the man who had pushed Jobs out, hadn't lasted either. The board showed him the door in 1993, the same door he had once closed on Jobs. 3 CEOs followed in rapid successions, each one proceeding over further decline. The company was losing $1 billion a year. Its stock had fallen from $70 to $14 while every other tech stock in Silicon Valley was soaring. Jobs watched all of this from the outside, and it was, by any measure, painful to watch. Then, in 1996, Apple CEO Gil Amelio made an announcement that changed everything. Apple needed a new operating system. The one they had been building internally for years, a project called Copland, was a disaster, years behind schedule, technically inadequate, and showing no signs of improvement. Amelio had publicly pronounced to find an alternative. He was running out of options and running out of time. He looked at several options. One company called B, run by Jean-Louis Gassi, the same man who had replaced Jobs at Apple a decade earlier, was asking $275 million for software Apple believed was worth about $50 million. Gassi overplayed his hand badly. That door closed, which left one other option, the very operating system Jobs had spent a decade building at NeXT. Jobs had been watching the whole thing unfold. He had tried to sell NeXT software to Apple years earlier and been turned away. But this time was different. Apple was desperate. Amelio was cornered, and Jobs never stopped believing that Apple was his company. He wasn't going to wait for a phone call. He called Amelio directly, telling him to not make any decisions until they have met. Amelio agreed. On December 2nd, 1996, Steve Jobs walked onto Apple's Cupertino campus for the first time in 11 years. He went straight to the whiteboard. He gave his first pitch, the 4 waves of computing, the rise of object-oriented software, the unique capabilities of NeXT operating system. He was, by all accounts, mesmerizing. Emilio later compared watching Jobs pitch to watching a great actor perform Shakespeare. Jobs was speaking to a man he didn't particularly respect, trying to sell a company he had largely failed, and he made it seem like the opportunity of a lifetime. He also made something else clear. Apple shouldn't just license the software. They should buy the whole company, take all the people. That was the real price. The negotiation happened over dinner at Jobs' house in Palo Alto, the two men sitting at a kitchen table. Jobs suggested $12 a share for NeXT. Emilio countered with $10. Jobs accepted immediately, more quickly than Emilio expected, which should have perhaps told Emilio something. The deal came to just over $400 million. Jobs would take $120 million in cash and the rest in Apple stock. As they walked around Palo Alto afterwards, Jobs asked to be put on Apple's board. Emilio, still caught in the gravitational pull of Jobs' presence, found himself agreeing. By the time Emilio drove away, he felt like he had made a friend for life. He had not. Within months, Jobs was quietly working the board, sharing his views on what Apple needed, making it clear, without ever saying it directly, that he was the only person who could actually fix the company. The board, watching Emilio struggle, started to listen. In July 1997, Emilio resigned. He had lasted 18 months. Jobs was asked to step in as interim CEO. He accepted. He was 42 years old. He had been away from Apple for 12 years and walked back in like he had never left. The first thing he did was look at products. Apple was making dozens of them. Jobs gathered the product team, listened, then drew a simple grid on the whiteboard. 2 columns, consumer and professional. 2 rows, desktop and portable. 4 boxes total. We only need 4 products, 1 for each box. Everything else goes. The cuts were brutal and swift. Printers gone, servers gone, the Newton, the personal digital assistant that Sculley had championed, gone. 15 of the company's 19 products were discontinued. Thousands of people were laid off. He also did something that shocked the industry. He called Bill Gates. Apple needed Microsoft to keep making Office for the Mac. Jobs swallowed whatever pride was necessary. Microsoft invested $150 million in Apple and committed to making Office for the Mac for at least 5 years. When Jobs announced it at Macworld, he made one of the few visual mistakes on his on-stage career. He appeared on stage, and then on a giant screen behind him, Bill Gates' face appeared via satellite link. Enormous, looking down at the audience like a benevolent giant. The crowd booed. Jobs held up his hand. This is about Apple getting healthy. It's not about winning. It's not about Microsoft losing. It's about Apple doing what's right. Apple's stock jumped 33% that day. Then came Think Different. He called his old friend Lee Cloud at the agency that made the 1984 commercial and told him he needed something that would remind people what Apple stood for. What came back was one of the great advertising campaigns in history. No products, no prices, no features. Just black and white photographs of people who had changed the world. Einstein, Gandhi, Picasso, Muhammad Ali, Jim Henson, Martin Luther King. With a voice saying, here's to the crazy ones, the misfits, the rebels, the troublemakers, the round pegs in the square holes, the ones who see things differently. They are not fond of rules, and they have no respect for the status quo. Because the people who are crazy enough to think they can change the world are the ones who do. Steve Jobs essentially founded Apple twice, and the second time, he was alone. When Jobs gave his first speech back at Apple, a 30-year-old British designer sitting in the audience had been planning to quit. Jony Ive had joined Apple in 1992 and watched helplessly as designers were reduced to decorators, given engineering specifications and told to build a shell around them. Then Jobs said Apple's goal was not to make money, it was to make great products. The money would follow. Ive decided to stay. Jobs toured Apple's design studio, met Ive properly, and within minutes realized they were thinking about design in exactly the same way. From that point on, they were almost inseparable. Lunch together most days, Jobs dropping by the studio each afternoon, the two of them walking around, picking things up, filling them, talking. What bound them was a shared belief. Real design meant understanding something so completely, how it worked, how it was made, what it was for, that you could strip away everything unnecessary and arrive at something pure. Simplicity wasn't a visual style. It was the result of going very deep. Their first product together was the iMac, an all-in-one computer for the home, ready to use straight out of the box. Ive proposed a translucent sea green blue casing you could see through to the components inside. He also nested a small handle into the top. It was meant to be a desktop computer. Most people would never carry it around. But Ive had a theory. People were still afraid of technology in 1998. If something has a handle, it feels approachable. It gives you permission to touch it. Jobs saw it immediately. He didn't need the explanation, he just knew it was right. The iMac went on sale in August of 1998 for $1,299. It sold 278,000 units in the first 6 weeks, 800,000 by the end of the year, the fastest selling computer in Apple's history. A third of the buyers were purchasing a computer for the first time. Apple was back, and it was only getting started. Jobs also needed somewhere worthy to sell what Apple was building. Computer sales had moved into big box stores where clerks knew little and cared less. An iMac could sit on the shelf between a Dell and a Compaq while someone recites specifications. Jobs found that intolerable. He hired Ron Johnson from Target, and the two of them spent months walking shopping malls together early in the mornings before stores opened, starting layouts, arguing about what made a retail space work. One night, Johnson woke up in a panic. They had organized their entire prototype store around Apple's product lines, but Jobs had been developing a new idea. The computer as the hub of your entire digital life. The store should be organized around what people do, not around what Apple makes. Johnson called Jobs. Jobs exploded. On a 7-minute drive to the warehouse, he told Johnson not to say a word. When they arrived, Jobs opened the meeting by telling the team that Ron had identified a fundamental flaw and they were going to fix it, even if it meant delaying the launch by months. Businessweek predicted the stores would fail within 2 years. Gateway stores were averaging 250 visitors a week. Within 3 years, Apple stores averaged 5,400. By 2004, they had crossed $1 billion in revenue, faster than any retail chain in history. The stores were just a stage. What really mattered was what was being sold in them. And in 2001, Jobs was about to change not just what Apple made, but what a technology company could be. By 2001, the world was declaring the personal computer's best days were behind them. The internet had changed everything, they said, and the PC was being left behind. Jobs disagreed. He was quietly reimagining what the computer could become. Not a device that ran spreadsheets, but a hub. The center of your entire digital life. He called it the digital hub strategy. It started with music. By 2001, people were ripping music from CDs at an extraordinary rate. 320 million blank CDs sold in the United States that year. Only 281 million people in the country. People weren't just listening to music. They were rebuilding their entire collections. Apple added CD burning to the iMac, acquired music management software, stripped it back to something simple, and named it iTunes. Then Jobs' hardware chief, John Rubinstein, flew to Japan to visit suppliers. In a meeting with Toshiba engineers, someone mentioned almost in passing that they had developed a tiny 1.8-inch hard drive, the size of a silver dollar, that could hold 1,000 songs. They weren't sure what to do with it. Rubinstein kept a poker face through the rest of the meeting. That night, he found Jobs. All I need is a $10 million check. Jobs authorized it on the spot. The development team settled on the fundamentals, the Toshiba drive, and the scroll wheel you could run your thumb around to navigate 1,000 songs. Jobs' main demand was simplicity. Every function had to be reachable in 3 clicks or fewer. The device would have no on and off switch. It would simply sleep when you stop and wake up when you touch it. Then, Jony Ive had an idea. The iPod should be pure white, not just the body. The headphones, the wires, the power block, everything. White wasn't just a color, it was a statement. Those white earphone wires became one of the most recognized design signatures in the history of consumer products. Jobs unveiled the iPod on October 23, 2001. He didn't walk to a table. He reached into his jean pockets and pulled out the gleaming white device. This amazing little device holds 1,000 songs, and it goes right into my pocket. Then he slipped it back in and walked off stage. The initial reaction was skeptical. The price was $399, and tech blogs immediately joked that iPod stood for idiots price our devices. Some dismissed it as an expensive toy for Mac users. At the time, the iPod only worked with Macs, which meant the vast majority of computer users in the world couldn't even use it. They were wrong. Within a year, the iPod had become the best-selling music player in the world. By 2007, just 6 years after that first reach into a pocket on the San Francisco stage, the iPod sales accounted for nearly half of Apple's entire revenue. The device that critics had dismissed as overpriced had quietly become the most important consumer electronics product of its generation. But more than the numbers, the iPod had done something far more significant. It had changed what Apple was. The company that had started in a garage building computers for hobbyists was now the company with a gleaming white device in the pocket of what felt like everyone on Earth. And Jobs was already thinking about what came next. The iPod solved how you listen to music you already owned. It didn't solve how you got new music. The music labels were terrified. Napster had showed them what the internet could do to their business. Their attempts at a legal alternative were so restrictive and poorly designed that PC World named them among the 25 worst tech products of all time. The music industry had created a legal alternative to piracy that was somehow worse than piracy itself. Jobs hated piracy. He believed creative work deserved to be paid for. His proposal was simple and radical. Sell individual songs for 99 cents each. The labels hated it. But piracy had already destroyed the album format. You couldn't compete with free by insisting people pay for things they didn't want. After over a year of meetings, negotiations, flattery, and force of will, Jobs had all 5 major labels signed. Nobody in the technology industry had ever managed it before. He walked on stage in April 2003 and showed them the alternative. 200,000 songs, 99 cents each, 1 click to buy, own it forever. With iTunes, it's not stealing anymore. It's good karma. Apple predicted the store would sell 1 million songs in 6 months. It sold 1 million songs in 6 days. Dr. Dre, one of the last artists Jobs had to win over, looked at the iTunes stores carefully when Jobs walked him through it and said something Jobs treasured for years. Man, somebody finally got it right. But even as the iPod and iTunes stores were transforming Apple, Jobs was already frustrated about something else entirely. He was sick of bad phones. Every phone on the market was terrible, complicated, cluttered, designed by people who clearly didn't use them. More than 825 million mobile phones were sold in 2005, and almost every single one was junk. But before Jobs could fix the phone, something happened at the dinner party that set him in a different direction entirely. One of the engineers developing a tablet at Microsoft happened to be married to a friend of Jobs and Laurene. At the dinner, the engineer spent the evening telling Jobs about a tablet his company was building, how it was going to change the world and eliminate laptop computers. He sat there listening, and the more he heard, the more irritated he became. The tablet used a stylus. Jobs came home furious. As soon as you have a stylus, you're dead. He walked into the office the next morning and told his team he wanted to build a tablet, and it couldn't have a keyboard or a stylus. Users would type by touching the screen directly on their fingers. As the team began working on it, Jony Ive quietly put Jobs aside for a private demonstration of something his design team had already been experimenting with separately. Multi-touch technology. A screen that could respond to multiple fingers at once. No stylus, no buttons, just glass and fingertips. Jobs watched it and went very quiet. This is the future, he said. And then he made a decision that surprised everyone. The tablet could wait, because Jobs had just realized that this same technology, multi-touch, could solve the problem he had been complaining about for years. The phone. Let's do the phone first, he told his team. We can always go back to the tablet. He spent part of every day for 6 months helping refine the display. The decision to eliminate a physical keyboard was one of the most debated of the entire project. Several team members pushed hard to keep one. The BlackBerry was enormously popular, and people loved its keyboard. Jobs was against it. A physical keyboard takes up permanent space, he said. It can never change. A software keyboard on the screen could become a number pad when dialing, a typewriter when writing, and disappear entirely when watching videos. By replacing hardware with software, the interface became fluid. The device could become whatever you needed it to be. For the screen, Jobs wanted glass, exceptionally strong, scratch-resistant glass. He called Wendell Wicks, the CEO of Corning Glass, and described what he needed. Wicks told him that Corning had actually developed exactly this kind of glass back in the 1960s. They called it Gorilla Glass, but had never found a market for it and had stopped making it. Jobs said he wanted as much as Corning could produce in 6 months. Wicks said that was impossible. Jobs fixed him with his unblinking stare and said, "Don't be afraid." Within 6 months, Corning had converted a factory in Kentucky and produced a glass that had never been made before at that scale. Close to completion, Jobs woke up one morning and called Ivy. "I didn't love it," he said. The aluminium case was competing with the display. The whole device should defer to the screen. The screen was the entire point, and the current design was getting in the way of that. They had spent 9 months on the design they had. Jobs told them that they were going to change it. All of it. They redesigned the iPhone around a thin, stainless steel bezel that allowed the Gorilla Glass display to go right off the edge. Every part of the device, the circuit boards, the antenna, the processor, was reconfigured to serve one purpose: the screen. The unveiling was at Macworld in San Francisco in January 2007. Jobs invited back many of the original Macintosh team, the people who had been there at the very beginning. He began the way he always did, by putting the new products in context before revealing it. Every once in a while, a revolutionary product comes along that changes everything, he said. He pointed to two early examples: the original Macintosh, which had changed the computer industry, and the iPod, which had changed the music industry. Then he built to what he was about to show them. Today, we are introducing three revolutionary products of this class. The first is a widescreen iPod with touch control. The second is a revolutionary mobile phone. And the third is a breakthrough internet communication device. He repeated the list: an iPod, a phone, and an internet communicator. An iPod, a phone. Are you getting it? These are not three separate devices, he said. This is one device, and we are calling it the iPhone. The room erupted. By the end of 2010, Apple had sold 90 million iPhones and was taking more than half of all the profits generated in the entire global mobile phone market. What followed was one of the greatest product runs in the history of business. Apple had sold just 1.39 million iPhones in its first year. By 2023, they were selling over 231 million in a single year. To date, over 2.6 billion iPhones have been sold since that January morning in 2007, making it the best-selling consumer electronic product in history. In 2025, Apple led the global smartphone market with a 20% market share, meaning roughly 1 in every 5 phones sold on Earth was an iPhone. In the US, the number climbs to 59%. There are now over 1.5 billion active iPhones around the world. The device that has started as a dinner party argument about stylus had become the most important object in the history of consumer technology. But while Jobs was changing the world from the stage, his body had been quietly keeping score. In October 2003, a urologist he happened to run into insisted he get a routine kidney scan. The kidneys were fine, but there was a shadow on his pancreas, and that changed everything. Laurene was in the waiting room when the doctors came out. She watched them tearing out with joy. It was a rare, slow-growing form of pancreatic cancer, an islet cell tumor, which meant it could potentially be surgically removed before it spread. He was extraordinarily lucky. The cancer had been caught almost by accident, and then he refused surgery. For 9 months, he resisted the only treatment his doctors were recommending. He threw himself into alternative approaches: strict diets, acupuncture, herbal remedies. His friends begged him to have the operation. Andy Grove of Intel drove to his house and stayed for 2 hours trying to convince him. None of it worked. Jobs had spent his entire life believing he could will reality to be what he wanted it to be. That belief had produced the Mac, the iPod, the Apple stores. But cancer doesn't respond to a reality distortion field. And deep down, the people who knew him best understood what was really happening. He was afraid. He simply didn't want them to open his body. By July 2004, a scan showed the tumor had grown and spread. He finally had the surgery at Stanford. During the operation, the doctors found 3 liver metastases. Had he acted 9 months earlier, they might have caught it before it spread. Something had shifted in him. He was turning 50. He had looked mortality in the face, and rather than making him more cautious, it had made him more intense. The illness reminded him he had nothing to lose. He should go full speed ahead. In June 2005, he gave Stanford's commencement address. What came out was unlike anything he had ever said in public. He started by giving advice to college graduates about life, about love, about entrepreneurship. And then he said this: "Remembering that I'll be dead soon is the most important tool I've ever encountered to help me make the big choices in life. Because almost everything, all external expectations, all pride, all fear of embarrassment or failure, these things just fall away in the face of death. Living only what is truly important. Remembering that you are going to die is the best way I know to avoid the trap of thinking you have something to lose. You are already naked. There is no reason not to follow your heart." The iPod had transformed music. The iPhone had transformed mobile. There was one more swing. Jobs put up a slide at the iPad launch, showing an iPhone and a laptop with a question mark between them. Is there room for something in the middle? Then he walked to a leather chair in the center of the stage, sat down casually, and picked up the iPad. "It's so much more intimate than a laptop," he said. Within a month, Apple had sold 1 million iPads, twice as fast as the iPhone had reached the milestone. 15 million in 9 months, by almost any measure, the most successful consumer product launch in history. A story circulated that moved him. A journalist staying at a dairy farm in Colombia handed his iPad to a 6-year-old boy who worked in the stables. The child had never seen a computer. With no instructions, the boy started swiping the screen, launching apps, playing games. He figured it out instantly. Jobs had designed a computer so completely built around the human being that an illiterate 6-year-old could use it without any help at all. That was exactly what he had been trying to build his entire life. By the summer of 2011, the cancer had spread to his bones. He was in pain most of the time. He ate almost nothing. His family watched helplessly as the vicious cycle tightened. Pain suppressing appetite. Weight loss making treatment harder. Treatment making eating harder. He used what time and energy he had carefully. Bill Gates came to see him in spring 2011. They spent more than 3 hours together, just the two of them, talking about everything. Education, family, the industry they had both shaped. At the end, Gates paid him a compliment Jobs hadn't expected. Throughout our careers, I used to believe the open horizontal model would prevail, but it proved that the integrated vertical model could also be great. Jobs nodded. Your model worked too, but it produced crappy products. That was the problem. The big problem. They both smiled. It was, in its own way, a perfect summary of 30 years. In August 24th, 2011, Jobs arrived at the Apple board meeting in a wheelchair. He read aloud from a letter he had written over the previous weeks. Just 8 sentences. I have always said that if there ever came a day when I could no longer meet the duties and expectations as Apple's CEO, I would be the first to let you know. Unfortunately, that day has come. He recommended Tim Cook as his successor and offered to serve as chairman. There was a long silence. Several board members had tears in their eyes. In the weeks that followed, Jobs sat in his garden on sunny afternoons and thought about things he hadn't had time to think about before. He had studied Buddhism for decades, had travelled to India as a young man searching for something he couldn't name. I like to think that something survives after you die, he said. It's strange to think that you accumulate all these experiences and maybe a little wisdom, and it just goes away. So I really want to believe that something survives. He fell silent for a long time, and then he smiled slightly. But, on the other hand, perhaps it's like an on and off switch. Click, and you're gone. He paused again. Maybe that's why I never liked putting on and off switches on Apple devices. Steve Jobs died on October 5th, 2011. He was 56 years old. Laurene was beside him, along with his sisters and his children. In his final hours, his breathing had become labored, with long pauses between each breath. Then, just before the end, he opened his eyes. He looked past the faces of the people he loved most in the world, focusing on something beyond them, something none of them could see. His expression was not one of fear, it was one of wonder. Oh wow, he said. Oh wow, oh wow. That was the life story of Steve Jobs. Now at the end of each episode, I try to distill the individual's life story into lessons we can all take away. These are not ordinary people, but I feel like we can take inspiration and lessons from their lives. But before we get into the lessons, I want to share with you 3 short stories I found that I just couldn't fit into the main story, but I thought it's still worth sharing it here. The first one, Steve Jobs' email to Adobe CEO. In 2005, Adobe had started recruiting Apple employees, directly targeting them. This wasn't illegal, but in Silicon Valley culture at the time, it was seen as aggressive, almost hostile. And after knowing this, Jobs personally emailed Adobe CEO Bruce Chizen with a blunt message. He said in the email, Bruce, Adobe is recruiting from Apple. They have hired 1 person already and are calling lots more. I have a standing policy with our recruiters that we don't recruit from Adobe. It seems you have a different policy. One of us must change our policy. Let me know who. Second, Jobs' strengths and weaknesses in management. I got this from the book Make Something Wonderful, Steve Jobs in his own words. It's a compilation of interviews and speeches from Steve. It's free. If you want to read it, it's on stevejobsarchive.com. One of the interviews was in the 1990s when Jobs was running NeXT and Pixar. 2 Stanford Business School students went to lunch with him at a charity auction and later interviewed him for a book profiling business leaders in technology. He was asked, "What do you think your weaknesses are when it comes to management?" He said, "I don't know. People are package deals. You take the good with the confused. In most cases, strength and weaknesses are 2 sides of the same coin. A strength in one situation is a weakness in another. Yet, often people can't switch gears. It's a very subtle thing to talk about strength and weaknesses because almost always they are the same thing. And then he proceeded to completely ignore the question and went straight to his strength. He continued, "My strength probably is that I've always viewed technology from a liberal arts perspective, from a human culture perspective. As such, I've always pushed for things that put technology in those directions by bringing insights from other fields. An example of that would be with the Macintosh. Its proportionally spaced fonts, its ease of use. All of the desktop publishing stuff on the Mac comes from books, the typography, that rich field that nobody in computers knew anything about. I think that my other strength is that I'm a pretty good judge of people and have the ability to bring people together around a common vision." Then the interviewer probed a bit more and asked when his strength, in this case his judgment of character and liberal arts perspective, becomes his weaknesses. He said, "In certain cases, my weaknesses are that I'm too idealistic. I need to realize that sometimes best is the enemy of better. Sometimes I go for best when I should go for better and end up going nowhere or backwards. I'm not always wise enough to know when to go for best and when to just go for better. Sometimes I'm blinded by what could be versus what is possible. Doing things incrementally versus doing them in one fell swoop. Balancing the ideal and the practical is something I still must pay attention to." Then he's asked about how he was able to motivate employees. He said, "Ultimately, it's the work that motivates people. I sometimes wish it were me, but it's not. It's the work. My job is to make sure that the work is as good as it should be and to get people to stretch beyond their best. But ultimately, it's the work that motivates people. That's what binds them together. Part of the CEO's job is to cajole and beg and plead and threaten at times, to do whatever is necessary to get people to see things in a bigger and more profound way than they have, and to do better work than they thought they could do. When they do their best and you don't think that it's enough, you tell them straight, 'This isn't good enough. I know you can do better. You need to do better. Now go and do better.' You must play those cards carefully. You must be right a lot of the times because you're messing with people's lives, but it's part of the job. In the end, it's the environment you create, the co-workers, and the work that binds. That's why it's important to pick very important things to do, because it's very hard to get people motivated to make a breakfast cereal. It takes something worth doing." The third story comes from the afterword of the book Creativity Inc., written by Ed Catmull, one of the co-founders of Pixar and the person that had worked the longest with Jobs, 26 years. The afterword, titled The Steve We Knew, is Ed Catmull's personal reflection of Steve Jobs, written after his death, and it strips away the public image of Jobs, the intense, demanding perfectionist that shows a more human version that only the people close to him saw. "I worked closely with Steve Jobs for 26 years. To this day, for all that had been written about him, I don't think that any of it comes close to capturing the man I knew. I've been frustrated that the stories about him tend to focus so narrowly on his extreme traits and the negative, difficult aspects of his personality. Inevitably, profiles of Steve describe him as stubborn, a man who held steadfastly and unwavering to his own ideas, refusing to budge or change, and who often tried to force others into doing things his way. While many of the anecdotes people repeat about his behavior as a young executive are probably accurate, the overall portrait is way off the mark. The reality is, Steve changed profoundly in the years that I knew him. The word genius is used a lot these days. Too much, I think. But with Steve, I actually think that it was warranted. Still, when I first came to know him, he was frequently dismissive. This is part of the Steve that people love to write about. I realize it is difficult to understand people who deviated so radically from the norm, like Steve did. And I suspect that those who focus on his more extreme traits do so because those traits are entertaining and revealing in some way. To let them drive Steve's narrative, however, is to miss the most important story. In the time that I worked with Steve, he didn't just gain the kind of practical experience you would expect to acquire while running two dynamic, successful businesses. He also got smarter about when to stop pushing people and how to keep pushing them, if necessary, without breaking them. He became fairer and wiser, and his understanding of partnership deepened. This shift didn't lead him to abandon his famous commitment to innovation. It solidified it. At the same time, he developed into a kinder, more self-aware leader, and I think Pixar played a role in that development. Then he went on to comment on the period after Apple, when Steve Jobs was building NeXT and funding Pixar without a clear path forward. Remember, in the late 1980s, when Pixar was founded, Steve was spending most of his time building NeXT, the computer company he started after being forced out of Apple. At Pixar, none of us, including Steve, knew what we were doing. In those early days, Steve sensed that there was something quite special going on at Pixar, but it frustrated him that he couldn't figure it out and kept losing money in the meantime. He had an expensive group that was ahead of its time. Could he hang on long enough for the potential to flower? Especially if he didn't know if it ever would flower. What kind of a person signs on for that? Would you? Then, he goes on to show how Steve's real calculus was different. He wasn't just looking for the right answers. He was looking for people who cared enough to fight for it. We tend to think of emotion and logic as two distinct, mutually exclusive domains. Not Steve. From the beginning, when making decisions, passion was a key part of that calculus. At first, he often elicited in a ham-handed way, by making extreme or outrageous statements and challenging people to respond. But at Pixar, even when we were a long way from being in the black, their aggressiveness was tempered by his acknowledgement that we knew things about graphics and storytelling that he did not. He respected our determination to be the first to make a computer-animated feature film. He didn't tell us how to do our work, or come in and impose his will. Even when we were unsure of how to reach our goals, our passion was something Steve recognized and valued. That's what Steve, John and I ultimately bonded over. Passion over excellence. A passion so solid we were willing to argue and struggle and stay together, even when things got extremely uncomfortable. Here's a great example of Steve's passion for passion. During A Bug's Life, there was a conflict. Filmmakers wanted widescreen for a better cinematic experience, while marketing pushed against it to protect DVD sales. Steve Jobs initially sided with marketing, thinking widescreen would hurt revenue. Ed Catmull wrote, "One afternoon, I took Steve around the offices so that he could see some of Pixar's departments in action, and we ended up in a room full of people who were working on lighting a scene from A Bug's Life. The production designer on the film, Bill Cohn, was showing some images on monitors that happened to be in widescreen format. Seeing this, Steve interjected that it was nuts for us to be making a widescreen movie. Bill, to his credit, came right back at him, explaining why the widescreen format was absolutely crucial from an artistic standpoint. An intense back and forth followed. I wouldn't call it an argument, but it was definitely heated. The discussion seemed to end inconclusively, and Steve and I continued on our rounds. Later, Bill came to see me looking rattled. "Oh my god," he said. "I was just arguing with Steve Jobs. Did I blow it?" "On the contrary," I told him, "you won." I could say something that Bill couldn't. Steve had responded to Bill's passion for the issue. The fact that Bill was willing to stand up so forcefully and articulately for what he believed showed Steve that Bill's ideas were worthy of respect. Steve never raised the format issue with us again. Then he went on to reflect on how Steve evolved from his time in Pixar. Perspective is so hard to capture. I worked with Steve for more than a quarter century, longer, I believe, than anyone else, and I saw an arc to his life that does not accord with the one-note portraits of relentless perfectionism I've read in magazines, newspapers, and even his authorized biographies. Relentless Steve, the boorish, brilliant, but emotionally tone-deaf guy that we first came to know, changed into a different man during the last 2 decades of his life. All of us who knew Steve well noticed the transformation. He became more sensitive not only to other people's feelings, but also to their value as contributors to the creative process. His experience with Pixar was part of this change. He used to say regularly that as brilliant as Apple products were, eventually, they all ended up in landfills. Pixar movies, on the other hand, would live forever. He believed, as I do, that because they dig for deeper truths, our movies will endure, and he found beauty in that idea. Pixar occupied a special place in Steve's world, and his role evolved during our time together. In the early years, he was our benefactor, the one who paid the bills to keep the lights on. Later, he became our protector, a constructive critic internally, but our fiercest defender to the outside. We had some trying times together, to be sure, but through those difficulties, we forged a rare bond. In the decade before his death, I watched Steve change Pixar even as Pixar changed him. While he never lost his intensity, we watched him develop the ability to listen. More and more, he could express empathy and caring and patience. He became truly wise. The change in him was real, and it was deep. Shortly before his death, John had visited Steve for the last time. We sat there for about an hour talking about coming projects he was so interested in. I looked at him and realized that this man had given me, given us, everything that we could ever want. I gave him a big hug. I kissed him on the cheek, and I said, "Thank you. I love you, Steve." The roller coaster came to a stop and a good friend got off. But what a ride we have taken together. It had been one hell of a trip. Now, beyond the stories, what truly matters are the lessons, what we can take away from his life and apply to our own. This next section is all about those lessons. Lesson 1. Do not fall to the dictates of convenience. Steve mentioned that Pixar was different, that they always believe story is king. He said that in Hollywood, they say story is king, but it really isn't. Because when push comes to shove, when a movie is in production, and there are budget constraints, and there are a lot of mouths to feed, and the story is not working, almost everyone falls to the dictates of convenience, and say, well, we'll just have to make the movie. And these are issues familiar to the Pixar team too. There is story crisis on every movie, productions rolling, and there are mouths to feed, and the story is just not working. But they stop. They stop and they fix the story. Even if Pixar is the most technology advanced studio in the world, John Lasseter has a saying that no amount of technology will turn a bad story into a good story. So the lesson here is to find what your customers or audience, and more importantly, what you truly care about, and do not fall to the dictates of convenience. Lesson 2. Make something with a great deal of care and love. For the longest time, Steve had an issue with Microsoft. In an interview in 1995, he said, "They were really strong opportunities. They just keep on coming. The only problem with Microsoft is that they have no taste. They have absolutely no taste. I have no problem with their success. I have a problem with the fact that they make really third-rate products. Their products have no spirit to them. They are very pedestrian. They are McDonald's." What he meant was simple. Anyone can make something that works, but very few make something that feels right, something thoughtful, something with taste. And taste is something that you can develop. In an interview with Michael Moritz, Steve was asked how he developed his taste. He said, "I don't think my taste in aesthetics is that much different than a lot of other people's. The difference is that I just get really stubborn about making things as good as we all know they can be. That's the only difference. Things get more refined as we make mistakes. I've had a chance to make a lot of mistakes. Your aesthetics get better as you make mistakes. But the real big thing is, if you're going to make something, it doesn't take any more energy, and rarely does it take more money to make it really great. All it takes is a little bit more time. Not that much more. And a willingness to do so. A willingness to persevere until it's really great." Lesson 3. Make your avocation your vocation. This was a speech Steve gave at a Palo Alto high school graduation in June 1996. He was 41 then. He said, "Make your avocation your vocation. Make what you love your work. The journey is the reward. Think of your life as a rainbow arching across the horizon of this world. You appear, have a chance to blaze in the sky, then you disappear. The two endpoints of everyone's rainbow are birth and death. We all experience both completely alone, and yet, most people of your age have not thought about these events very much less even seen them in others. How many of you have seen the birth of another human? It is a miracle. And how many of you have witnessed the death of a human? It is a mystery beyond our comprehension. No human alive knows what happens to us upon or after our death. Some believe this, others that, but no one really knows at all. Again, most people of your age have not thought about these events very much, and it's as if we shelter you from them, afraid that the thought of mortality will somehow wound you. For me, it's the opposite. To know my arc will fall makes me want to blaze while I'm still in the sky. Not for others, but for myself, for the trail I know I am living. Now, as you leave your arc across the sky, you want to have as few regrets as possible. Remember, regrets are different from mistakes. Mistakes are those things that you did and wish you could do over again. In some, you were a fool. In others, you were scared. In others, you hurt someone else. Some mistakes are deep, others not. But if your intent was pure, they are almost always enriching in some way. So mistakes are things you did and wish you could do over again. Regrets are more often things you didn't do and wish you did. Lesson 4. Great products comes from great people. In the 1990s, when Steve was running NeXT and Pixar, he was interviewed by 2 students, and this is what he has to say about hiring. "I spend 20% of my time recruiting. Even now, I spend a day a week helping people recruit. It's one of the most important things you can do." Then he's asked, "If finding the A players is so important, how can you tell who is an A player and who isn't?" Here's what Steve has to say. "That's a very hard question. Ultimately, there are 2 paths. If a candidate has been in the workplace for a while, you have to look at results. There are people who look so good on paper and talk such a good story, but have no results behind them. They can't point to breakthroughs of successful products that they shipped and played an integral part in. Ultimately, the results should lead you to the people. As a matter of fact, that's how I find great people. I look at great results, and I find out who was responsible for them." However, sometimes young people haven't had the opportunity yet to be in the position of influence to create such results. So here you must evaluate potential. It's certainly more difficult, but the primary attributes of potential are intelligence and the ability to learn quickly. Much of it is also drive and passion. Hard work makes up for a lot. When you recruit, you're rolling the dice, no matter what. No matter what, you're rolling the dice because you've only got an hour to assess the candidates. The most time I spend with somebody is an hour, and I must then recommend whether we hire the person or not. Others will recommend too, so I won't be the only one. But I'll still have to throw my vote in the hat. Ultimately, it comes down to your gut feeling. Your gut feeling gets refined as you hire more people and see how they do. Some you thought would do well don't, and you can sense why. If you study it a bit, you might say, I thought this person was going to do well, but I overlooked this aspect. Or I don't think this person will do well, but they did, and here's why. As you hire people over time, your gut instincts get better and more precise. Over time, my digging in during interviews gets more precise. For example, many times in an interview, I will purposely upset someone. I will criticize their prior work. I'll do my homework, find out what they worked on, and say, God, that really turned out to be a bomb. That really turned out to be a bozo product. Why do you work on that? And the worst thing that someone can do in an interview is to agree with me and knuckle under. What I look for is for someone to come right back and say, you're dead wrong and here's why. I want to see what people are like under pressure. I want to see if they're just full, or they have firm conviction, belief, and pride in what they did. It's also good every once in a while to really piss someone off in an interview to see how they react. Because if your company is a meritocracy of ideas, with passionate people, you have a company with a lot of arguments. If people can't stand up and argue well under pressure, they may not do well in such an environment. Lesson 5. Control the experience or lose it. One of Jobs' most fundamental beliefs was that hardware and software had to be designed together, not because he was a control freak, though he was, but because he understood something most technology companies didn't. The experience is the product, not the specs, not the features, not the price. The moment someone picks it up, turns it on, opens the box, that moment is the product. And you can only control that moment if you control every layer of what produces it. Think about what this meant in practice for Jobs. He obsessed over the circuit boards inside the Mac that no customers would ever see, because a craftsman cares about the back of the cabinets. He redesigned the packaging 50 times because the experience of opening the box is part of the product. He built Apple's own retail stores because he couldn't trust someone else to be the last thing between Apple and its customers. He fought to keep hardware and software locked together because the moment you open the platform, you hand the experience to someone who doesn't care about it the way you do. Every decision pointed in the same direction. From the inside of the case to the floor of the store, from the circuit boards to the shopping bag, control every layer, or lose the thing that makes it yours. Microsoft proved you could win a big market by doing the opposite, by opening everything up, licensing to everyone, letting the market decide. Gates himself admitted years later that he would give a lot to have Jobs' taste, because taste requires control, and control requires the courage to close the door and say, this is how it works, and we are not compromising it because someone asked us to. Jobs lost the operating system war to Microsoft, but he never changed his belief. And 30 years later, when iPhone made Apple one of the most valuable companies in the world, it was built on exactly that same principle. One device, one operating system, every layer designed together, every detail controlled. He had been right all along. It had just taken the world 30 years to see it. The final lesson, lesson 6. The world is malleable. Steve said, when you grow up, you tend to get told that the world is the way it is, and your life is just to live inside that world. Try not to bash into the walls too much, try to have a nice family life, have fun, save a little money. But that's a very limited life. Life can be much broader once you discover one simple fact, and that is, everything around you that you call life was made up by people that were no smarter than you. And you can change it, you can influence it, you can build your own things that other people can use. To shake off this notion that life is there and you're just going to live in it, versus embrace it, change it, improve it, make your mark upon it. This is Season 1, Episode 2 of Crafted Archive. Thanks for tuning in. If you enjoyed this episode, consider hitting the subscribe button, leaving a like, post a comment, tell a friend. It allows me to keep making stories like this, stories with the depth they deserve. And if you're listening on audio, you can find Crafted Archive on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and all major podcast platforms. I'll see you in the next episode.